54 years ago, a 5-year-old girl left her home in the town of Gallup, New Mexico, on what seemed like an ordinary morning, and never returned. The initial search quickly stalled. No accident, no body, just a short stretch of Route 66 that suddenly became an unsolved void. Authorities gradually concluded that she had died. The case was frozen in time, leaving the family to live in waiting and unanswered questions. Yet, for decades, small overlooked details lingered quietly in old reports, administrative papers, and federal data that no one revisited. Then, a new investigation decision, starting with a completely different assumption, uncovered a chain of discoveries that forced the entire story to be reconsidered in a way no one had ever imagined. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the morning of June 12, 1970, Gallup, New Mexico, woke up like any other summer morning. Clear skies, desert sun pouring down on the low streets, running parallel to Route 66, where trucks and cars occasionally passed by, leaving behind the dry whistle of wind and the distinctive hot dust smell of the American Southwest. In the small house of the Jensen family, 5-year-old Clara Jensen, wearing her familiar bright-colored dress, was allowed by her mother to walk alone to the nearby grocery store, a distance of just a few hundred meters, the path she saw every day through the window. Clara stepped out of the house with short, quick steps, her little feet touching the lightly hot pavement. Everything around her was so familiar that no one thought this morning was any different from the others. Gallup was a town where everyone knew each other's faces, where kids often played out front, where Route 66 was both a vital traffic artery and a familiar backdrop to daily life. Clara followed the well-trodden path, repeated many times in adult memory, past the corner of the old diner, along the cracked sidewalk, toward the grocery store where the glass door reflected the harsh sunlight. There was no hurry, no sense of danger, just a child on a path adults believed was safe. A neighbor later recalled seeing Clara standing in front of the store door, her small hand on the handle, then turning her head to look back toward her house, as if confirming that familiar distance was still there, as if everything was still under control. That was the last image of Clara Jensen that morning. After that moment, time began to flow differently. The first few minutes meant nothing, just the usual delay of a child distracted by candy shelves or watching cars on Route 66. But then 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20, and Clara did not return. In the Jensen home, waiting shifted from calm to restless. The mother looked out the door, thinking perhaps the girl was chatting with someone familiar, that it would just take a little more time. But as the clock hands kept moving, unease began to creep into the quiet morning space. The family stepped outside, looked down the short road to the store, called Clara's name under the increasingly harsh sun. No answer, no small figure running back. The first searches were hesitant, still hoping Clara was just somewhere very close, out of sight. But with each passing minute, that familiar road grew longer, emptier. When the Jensen family realized Clara had not returned as she had on every other morning, worry crossed the threshold of endurance. The small town's silence suddenly became heavy. Finally, in a moment no one in the family had ever imagined, they went back inside and picked up the phone, dialed the Gallup police, the voice on the other end echoing in the room like an irreversible milestone. That ordinary morning had ended, and Clara Jensen had vanished. The Gallup Police Department received the missing person call from the Jensen family late that morning, and within minutes, the case was escalated from a routine civilian report to a high-priority missing child file. The first 2 officers dispatched to the house near Route 66 took initial statements, while basic questions were asked repeatedly, succinctly, and urgently: what time Clara left, what she was wearing, where she was going, where she was last seen, and who saw her. Right at the scene, police established the initial timeline based on family and neighbor statements. Clara left home mid-morning, and the last confirmed sighting was her standing in front of the grocery store, just a few hundred meters from home, turning to look back down the familiar road home. From that moment on, everything became a blank. In the file, that blank was marked in minutes and hours, because in a child missing case, every passing minute carried a different weight than in other incidents. Investigators quickly reconstructed the short route from the Jensen home to the store, walking each section, measuring distances, identifying blind spots and places a child might stop without catching an adult's eye. Clara's familiar path was divided into small segments, from the gate, past the corner where the pavement started cracking, to the sidewalk parallel to Route 66, then to the store door with its sun-reflecting glass. Each segment was noted in the investigation log, not because they were special, but because their very ordinariness raised the most troubling question: where could a child disappear in such a short familiar space? Within the first few hours, the case was officially classified as missing child, high risk, a pivotal decision that allowed police to mobilize additional resources and expand operations without waiting for rigid timelines. No assumptions were recorded as conclusions, but investigators knew Clara's disappearance wasn't like a child simply wandering off in a park or hiding at a friend's house. The file was opened with a focus on time: how long since Clara left home, the maximum distance a 5-year-old could travel in each time frame, and what could happen in the gap between the last sighting and when the family started searching. Initial investigation decisions were made quickly, sometimes based solely on experience and professional instinct. One group of officers stayed in the Jensen neighborhood to continue gathering information from those nearby that morning, while another went straight to the grocery store, not to search for physical evidence, but to confirm the exact time Clara might have arrived there. Investigators focused on synchronizing statements, noting every detail related to timing, because in cases like this, a discrepancy of just a few minutes could change the entire direction of the file. At the same time, the route from home to store was cordoned as a narrow investigation corridor, prioritizing checks of spots where a child could be out of sight briefly, without drawing attention. These decisions were made in a context with no clear signs of what happened to Clara, and that very lack of information forced police to act fast, focusing on establishing the investigation framework before witness memories faded hour by hour. In the Gallup Police Department duty room, the file named Clara Jensen was opened, numbered, and placed on the desk like dozens of others before it, but the shared feeling among investigators was different. A 5-year-old child doesn't just vanish from a few hundred-meter road without a trace, and this realization, though not yet written as an official line, quietly guided every decision in the first hours of the investigation. Right around noon on June 12, 1970, while the Clara Jensen file still lay open on the Gallup Police Department duty desk, witness collection began urgently, but systematically, because investigators knew that in a daytime child disappearance, time was decisive, and human memories fade quickly after just a few hours. Small teams were divided, each carrying notebooks, walkie-talkies, and nearly identical question lists, with the sole goal of reconstructing Clara Jensen's morning through accounts from those closest to her. At the grocery store on Route 66, identified as the last place Clara might have reached, morning shift employees were interviewed separately to avoid influencing each other. One employee said she remembered seeing a little girl near the entrance late that morning, but couldn't confirm it was Clara, since kids often came in and out of the store in this town. Another was certain no child had entered from opening until near noon. These responses were recorded verbatim, with interview times noted, because investigators knew how a person answered was as important as what they said. Leaving the store, investigators knocked on doors of houses along the route from the Jensen home to the store, asking seemingly simple but potentially decisive questions. Did they see Clara pass by? At what time? And was she alone or with someone? An elderly neighbor said he saw Clara walking with her familiar gait, head down looking at the pavement, like on many previous mornings. Another recalled her pausing briefly near the store door, seemingly waiting for someone or talking to an adult, but when pressed, couldn't recall the person's gender, clothing, or direction. The statements began forming mismatched timeline pieces. Some said they saw Clara earlier, others insisted it was a few minutes later. In a case like this, a 5 or 10-minute difference could completely shift the investigation direction, and investigators quickly realized establishing an accurate timeline would be harder than expected. Passers-by on Route 66 were also approached, especially drivers who stopped at the store or drove slowly through the area that morning. However, most only remembered the intense heat, engine noise and sparse traffic, not a specific child's face. One driver said he might have seen a little girl near the curb, but wasn't sure if it was a real memory or just speculation after hearing about the disappearance. When all these statements were brought back to the duty room and spread out on the table, investigators began cross-referencing them, marking overlaps and contradictions. They realized no single statement was strong enough to stand alone as certain fact. All depended on how they fit together. One investigator tried reconstructing the sequence by placing statements on a timeline, but the result was still a series of broken gaps. In that context, the initial report on Clara Jensen's disappearance was drafted by day's end, aiming to create a clear summary for subsequent steps to build on. The report focused on the least contradictory details. Clara left home in the morning, walked the familiar route to the grocery store, and did not return. Speculative statements, uncertain details, or those hard to verify immediately, were relegated to appendices or omitted from the main summary. This decision made the initial file neat and understandable, but also blurred small anomalies that appeared from day one. Remarks like "maybe she wasn't alone," or "I just glimpsed," weren't emphasized because they didn't fit the clear picture the report was building. When the first report was completed and signed, it became the official foundation for the entire subsequent investigation. No one in the duty room then could know that those small contradictions in statements and details overlooked on the first day would follow the Clara Jensen file for years, like questions never fully answered. Once the initial report on Clara Jensen's disappearance was drafted and filed, the Gallup Police Department moved to internal cross-checking, where investigators reread every line of notes, comparing them to what they'd heard directly from witnesses on day one. It was during this seemingly purely administrative process that the first inconsistencies gradually emerged. One investigator noticed at least one statement that didn't fully align with the Clara walking alone narrative reflected in the official report. That statement came from a neighbor near the grocery store, who with clear hesitation said he remembered seeing Clara standing in front of the door and seemingly talking to an adult. In the original notes, this detail was marked uncertain and not included in the main report summary. When re-interviewed, the neighbor stuck to his account. He wouldn't swear he saw clearly, but he believed Clara wasn't alone in that moment. However, in the official file, that detail didn't exist. The report described Clara as last seen alone, a short, clear, understandable phrase that didn't fully reflect what was said in initial interviews. This difference didn't trigger strong immediate reaction, because in the early hours of an investigation, investigators often make quick choices about which information is reliable enough to serve as foundation. Yet, as statements were examined more closely, questions formed in some minds. If Clara truly wasn't alone, why was that detail sidelined? Experienced investigators knew witness statements are rarely perfect, especially for moments that seemed ordinary before an unusual event. But they also knew completely discarding a detail just for uncertainty could mean missing a key investigation path. In the duty room, a copy of the report was placed beside raw interview notes, and the difference between the two sources became clearer side by side. In the handwritten notes, phrases like "maybe" seemed and "I'm not sure" reflected witness hesitation. In the official report, those words vanished, replaced by a neat event sequence where Clara left home, walked alone, and vanished without trace. That neatness gave the file a sense of control, but flattened details that didn't fit the emerging story. A younger investigator asked if the statement about Clara not being alone should be added back to the report, but the question quickly sank amid other pending tasks. The priority was continuing the search and gathering more information, not revising a signed report. Gradually, the gap between what witnesses said and what the file reflected formed as a small but clear crevice. In internal discussions, some investigators referenced that initial statement, but each time, it came with caution, just a feeling, uncertain, not strong enough. Those repeated phrases gradually weakened the detail's weight in the team's shared perception. Meanwhile, the official report continued as the primary reference for subsequent decisions, with every step based on the assumption Clara was alone. The difference between witness-told reality and file-recorded reality wasn't the result of intentional concealment, but a consequence of pressure to create a clear picture amid fragmented information. However, that very difference laid the groundwork for a larger issue. Once an assumption is written into official text, it tends to become default truth, even if initial data doesn't fully support it. As the first day of the investigation closed, the Clara Jensen file existed in parallel forms, one raw statements full of hesitation and contradiction, the other the official report, neat and consistent. The distance between these forms, though not fully recognized then, had begun to form, and over time, it would become a key point driving the investigation in a certain direction, despite early signs that reality might be far more complex. After the first inconsistencies between witness statements and the official report began to be identified, the Gallup Police Department shifted focus to canvassing the area and searching for any physical evidence that could help narrow the gap between the moment Clara Jensen was last seen and when she completely vanished from adult sight. This work was conducted methodically, starting with the short route connecting the Jensen family home to the grocery store on Route 66. Investigators walked the entire distance again, slowly, observing every small detail a 5-year-old child might interact with: cracked sidewalk edges, dusty curbs, hidden corners where visibility was blocked by billboards or temporarily parked vehicles. Each section was noted not just for location, but for the potential of an incident occurring without drawing attention, because the very normality of this space made Clara's disappearance so baffling. The grocery store, where Clara was last seen, became the next focal point. Police checked the area in front of the door, around the entrance, and the side of the building, looking for any unusual signs that might have been overlooked in the initial hours. They recorded the ground condition, scratches, shoe marks, but there were no indications of a struggle having occurred. Inside the store, shelves, narrow aisles, and the area near the checkout were examined closely, not for evidence of violence, but to determine if Clara had actually entered. There were no clear signs proving she had been inside long enough to draw attention, and this further blurred the boundary between whether Clara disappeared before or after reaching the glass door. From the grocery store, the search radius expanded to nearby vacant lots and wilderness areas, places a curious or disoriented child might accidentally wander into. Investigators and volunteers combed each area, checking low bushes, sunken patches of land, and small trails leading away from Route 66. However, the results remained a troubling emptiness. No biological traces, no discarded clothing, nothing indicating Clara had suffered an accident or injury in these areas. During the area canvass, items associated with Clara that morning began to be officially recorded in the file. The clothing she wore when leaving home was described in detail, not just for identification but to cross-reference with any later citizen reports. Small items Clara carried were also listed, not as evidence of an incident, but as markers showing she left home in a completely normal state. This recording was procedural, but it also highlighted a notable fact: none of Clara's belongings were found along the route or around the store, which is common in accident or wandering cases. The complete absence of physical traces began to create unease in the investigation team. In child accident or wandering cases, there is usually at least one small item left behind, a sign the child was somewhere, and something happened. Here, there was nothing. No signs of struggle, no skid marks from a fall, no items dropped on the ground. Everything on the route from home to store remained unchanged, as if Clara had never walked it that morning. Investigators noted this in the file with cautious language, avoiding hasty conclusions, but internally, a realization began to form: Clara's disappearance left no traces, because there might not have been a physical incident in these spaces. This did not rule out accident, but it significantly reduced the likelihood that Clara had met trouble on her own on the familiar route. As the day wore into afternoon, the search for physical evidence and area canvassing continued without clear answers. The case file grew thicker with detailed notes on what had been checked and, equally important, what had not been found. The lack of signs of violence or accident brought no relief. Instead, it made the picture of the morning Clara vanished more frightening, because it showed the event had occurred silently and quickly, enough to leave no traces in a space everyone still believed was safe. When the area canvass within the town yielded no physical traces, the Gallup Police Department was forced to expand the investigation beyond the town's familiar boundaries, and Route 66 immediately became the top priority axis. This road was not just the main traffic route through Gallup, but a constant flow of strangers, long-haul drivers, tourists, transients, who appeared and vanished in hours. Investigators started by checking lists of vehicles that stopped at the grocery store on the morning of June 12, based on employee statements and remaining receipts. However, this quickly revealed its limits: no surveillance cameras, no recorded license plates, and most cash transactions left no identifying traces. The vehicles that passed Route 66 that morning only existed in fragmented human memories, and as investigators had seen, those memories were not always reliable. Police approached gas stations, roadside diners, and nearby parking lots, asking about unusual vehicles, people with odd behavior, or anyone who might have noticed a child standing alone. Some recalled seeing trucks stop briefly. Others said that morning was no different from any other. No statements were specific enough to pinpoint a vehicle or individual. Meanwhile, an unavoidable reality emerged. Traffic on Route 66 had not been blocked in time. In the first hours after Clara Jensen was reported missing, vehicles continued flowing through town, carrying possibilities no one could catch up to. The decision not to block the road did not stem from indifference, but from the context that morning. No clear evidence of abduction, no suspect description, no strong legal grounds to stop and check masses of vehicles. However, as time passed, and no traces were found in town, not blocking Route 66 began to be seen as a missed opportunity. Investigators revisited the case's most critical time window, from when Clara was last seen in front of the store, to when the family called police. In that gap, Route 66 had taken in and released dozens, even hundreds of vehicles, each capable of leaving Gallup without a trace. Attempting to trace that flow backward was nearly impossible, with no specific stopping point to start from. Some investigators proposed expanding to nearby towns, sending alerts to police departments along Route 66, hoping someone might recall an overlooked detail. These alerts were sent, but they faced the same issue: lack of specifics. No plates, no vehicle description, no suspect profile. All that could be provided was the image of a 5-year-old girl who vanished in a short time in a small town. Internally, tension rose as the team realized each passing hour closed that time window a bit more. What could have been controlled in the first hours, stopping vehicles, quick questions, preliminary checks, had become a retrospective puzzle with too many variables. Notes began reflecting this shift, from lines describing specific actions to cautious assessments of the possibility Clara had left Gallup unnoticed. Though no one said it officially, in many investigators' minds, this possibility grew increasingly troubling. Route 66, once seen as a harmless town backdrop, now loomed as a wide-open escape anyone could use to vanish with a child in minutes. As evening fell, efforts to expand the investigation beyond town continued, but the shared feeling was the race against time had tilted against them. The most critical time window, the moment quick action could have made a difference, had closed without anyone realizing it was gradually shutting. In the Clara Jensen file, Route 66 was marked not just as a road, but as the boundary where the investigation began shifting from searching within reach to facing possibilities beyond the small town's control. When expanding the investigation beyond Gallup yielded no specific leads, and Route 66 emerged as an untraceable flow, the focus of the Clara Jensen file began to shift quietly, but decisively. In internal meetings of the Gallup Police Department and Sheriff's Office, a hypothesis was mentioned increasingly often, at first just as a possibility to consider, then gradually as the dominant thinking. Clara might have wandered off the familiar route and died, due to the harsh environment around town. New Mexico is not a place that forgives human mistakes easily, especially for a 5-year-old child. The dry, hot desert, vast empty lands, and wilderness areas around Gallup were seen as potential dangers, and in the context of no traces of violence or struggle, this hypothesis began to carry psychological weight for the team. Discussions shifted from who took Clara to if Clara wandered off, how far could she have gone before exhaustion. This change was not recorded in an official decision, but it showed clearly in resource allocation and the language appearing in notes. Search teams were deployed deeper into wilderness areas around town, focusing on ravines, dry grass fields, and hard-to-access terrain a child might accidentally enter. The work's focus was no longer reconstructing Clara's final human interactions, but searching for traces of a silent accident. In internal reports, the phrase recovery operation began appearing, a term often used when the chance of finding the victim alive is deemed low. Notably, this shift occurred without any specific evidence Clara had died. No torn clothing, no fall signs, no blood or biological traces in searched areas. However, in investigative psychology, the lack of human traces on the familiar route was interpreted as indirect evidence. Clara had left the social space and entered the natural one, where traces are easily erased. Searches lasted consecutive days under scorching sun, with every meter carefully checked, but results remained silence. Gradually, that silence was interpreted in the most convenient way. Nothing found because there was nothing left to find. In investigator discussions, the hypothesis of Clara wandering and dying from the environment began to be called the most reasonable scenario given the lack of other leads. This led to an important consequence. Other directions, especially those involving human intervention, began to be downgraded. Inconsistent witness details, like Clara possibly not being alone in front of the store, gradually became seen as unreliable memory errors, because they didn't fit the dominating hypothesis. The file continued thickening with search maps, lists of canvassed areas, and notes on environmental conditions, while the part about Clara's social interactions that morning received no further expansion. This shift did not stem from negligence, but from human psychological need. When facing a prolonged case without resolution, a clear assumption, even unproven, is easier to accept than prolonged ambiguity. However, that very assumption created an invisible lock on the investigation. Once a line of thinking becomes default, all new information is interpreted through its lens. Not finding death evidence was no longer seen as a sign the hypothesis might be wrong, but explained as the environment erasing all traces. In subsequent reports, language grew more conclusive, despite no corresponding new data. Clara Jensen gradually became referred to as a child, presumed deceased, a halfway phrase but enough to shape how later file readers thought. The most frightening part of this process was how gradually it happened. With almost no one noticing the exact moment, the investigation shifted from exploring all possibilities to reinforcing one assumption. No minutes recorded other directions being fully discarded, but in practice, they were no longer pursued with the same urgency. As days and months passed, and searches yielded no results, that wrong hypothesis gradually became the foundation for all subsequent decisions. The Clara Jensen investigation did not end here, but from this point, it began to be guided by an unproven assumption, and that assumption quietly locked the door to other possibilities, leaving in the file a void, whose full consequences no one would understand for many years. As the hypothesis that Clara Jensen had wandered off and died due to the environment gradually dominated the shared thinking of the investigation, an inevitable consequence began to appear in the file. The people who had passed through Gallup in the summer of 1970 and then left shortly afterward were no longer seen as a priority to clarify. Only many weeks after Clara disappeared, when searches in natural areas yielded no results, a new investigator proposed re-examining the list of those who had left town in the short period after the case. This proposal was not considered urgent, but it was enough to open a secondary file section where information about temporary residents, short-term renters, and individuals who suddenly moved began to be gathered belatedly. That list, when revisited, was not overly long, but it contained names that, if placed under the light of the first day, might have prompted entirely different questions. Some people on the list had left Gallup just days or weeks after Clara vanished, with reasons noted cursorily as job transfer, returning home, or no longer renting. In the context of a small town on Route 66, People coming and going was not unusual, and that very normality made these names not seem suspicious. However, when investigators tried to cross-reference this list with those interviewed in the early days, they noticed something noteworthy. Not everyone who left Gallup had been questioned. A few names did not appear at all in the 1970 witness statement section of the file. The reason was noted briefly in the file margin: not relevant. This phrase, seemingly harmless, hid behind it a series of implicit decisions made in the context of pressure and dominating assumptions. In 1970, with the investigation focused on the possibility of an environmental accident, spending time tracking down those who had left town was seen as offering no practical value. There was no evidence Clara had contact with them, no direct witnesses, and no clear reason to hold them for extended interviews. In retrospect, investigators realized many individuals on this list had left Gallup before the investigation expanded along Route 66, meaning they vanished from authorities' reach during the very period the investigation window was still open. Some personal files only had names and temporary addresses, no long-term contact phones, making later tracing difficult. In this belated canvass, investigators tried to determine if anyone who left town had direct or indirect ties to the route Clara took that morning. They cross-referenced the list with housing locations, workplaces, and recorded daily habits, but most information existed only at a minimal level. A few names were flagged for further review, but immediately hit a major barrier: time. Many had moved to other states, some had relocated multiple times, and the 1970 file was not designed for long-term tracing like that. The not relevant notes in the initial file now became a bottleneck, as they did not explain why that decision was made, nor provide a basis for objective re-evaluation. Younger investigators, rereading the file, could not know if those individuals had been seriously considered or simply overlooked because they did not fit the prevailing hypothesis at the time. This lack of information created a gray area in the case history, where real people had existed, been in Gallup at the critical time, then disappeared from the file without raising major questions then. As the canvass continued, some names were mentioned again in internal discussions, but no one had enough data to assert they should be viewed as suspects, or just passers-by, unlucky to appear at the wrong time. The most concerning aspect was not whether these people were involved, but the fact that the 1970 investigation had not asked the right questions at the most important time. By labeling not relevant those who left town, the file had closed itself off to other possibilities, and when investigators years later tried to reopen that door, they were left with only scattered information fragments and names no longer easily found. In the overall picture of the Clara Jensen case, the list of those never questioned became clear evidence of how a wrong assumption could quietly shape the entire investigation direction, not through loud decisions, but through short, seemingly harmless notes in the file. By the end of the 1980s, after nearly 20 years without substantial breakthroughs, the Clara Jensen file was officially classified as a cold case by the Gallup Police Department, an administrative step but one that also marked an important shift in how the case was perceived. There was no public announcement of closing the case, no press conference declaring the investigation over. Instead, the file was simply moved from high priority status and placed in storage, where hundreds of other unsolved cases lay silent. From that point, Clara Jensen was no longer an ongoing missing person case, but a name from the past, tied to a specific year and a file growing dustier. Moving the file to cold case status did not stem from new evidence, but from the prolonged absence of any leads that could prompt action. What remained in the file were search reports, maps of canvassed areas, contradictory witness statements, and margin notes hastily written in the early years. No significant updates were added in the many years after, as no new events forced police to reopen this file. Scattered calls from the public, vague reports of seeing a woman resembling Clara here or there, if any, were not specific enough to cross the threshold for serious review. The Clara Jensen file existed in a limbo state, not declared resolved, but no longer seen as likely to progress. In this process, the language used in internal documents gradually changed. Clara was no longer referred to as a missing child, but as a victim presumed deceased, a phrase reflecting the assumption formed in the early years, and never systematically challenged. Notably, This shift occurred without any confirming evidence. It was simply the result of time and the lack of new information. When later generation investigators reread the file, they approached it with a completely different mindset than those directly involved in 1970. To them, Clara Jensen was an old case, thoroughly examined in its time context, and with little left to exploit. The initial contradictions in witness statements, overlooked details, and the list of those never questioned all lay quietly in the pages, not re-questioned due to no clear motive to do so. Most importantly, a key question never appeared in the official file: what if Clara is still alive? This question was not asked not because it was impossible, but because it did not fit the assumption deeply embedded in how the case was viewed. When a file is labeled cold case, it is often approached with the goal of seeking closure, not opening new possibilities. In Clara Jensen's case, the envisioned closure had long been finding remains or confirming death, not searching for an adult living under a different identity. The absence of the question, "What if Clara is still alive?" became a major thinking gap, but at the time, it was not recognized as a problem. Investigative technologies were limited, federal databases not connected, and the concept of tracing identity through biology was almost non-existent in local police practice. Thus, the Clara Jensen file was seen as having reached the limit of what could be done. Many years passed, investigators retired, those who had directly worked on this file left the force, taking with them personal memories of decisions made under time pressure. The file lay dormant in storage, only pulled out for periodic checks, or when another case with similarities needed reference. Each time, it was returned unchanged, like evidence of cases time had rendered immobile. The freezing of the file was not an act of abandonment, but the accumulated result of years without progress and an unchallenged assumption. As the 1990s approached, Clara Jensen still only existed in old file pages, with no new updates, no new investigation strategy, and most importantly, no one officially re-asking the foundational question about the little girl's fate. The case had been frozen, not because the truth was found, but because the system had reached a point where it no longer knew what to ask. In 2023, more than half a century after the morning Clara Jensen vanished from Gallup, the file that had lain dormant in storage was removed from the dusty shelf and placed on the desk of the New Mexico Cold Case Unit, a unit established to re-examine old cases with modern thinking and tools. Taking on the Clara file did not stem from a new lead or sudden tip, but from a systematic review of child disappearances before 1980, where a simple but decisive criterion was applied: cases without authenticated evidence of death. On that list, Clara Jensen stood out alarmingly. No body, no accident scene, no forensic evidence confirming death, just a decades-long assumption repeated long enough to become default truth. When Cold Case Unit investigators began rereading the file from start to finish, they were not looking for a new detail but for questions never asked. Right in the first meetings, a consensus formed quickly: if they continued approaching this file with the goal of finding remains, they would only repeat the path that led to deadlock in the past. Instead, a strategic decision was made. Completely reversing old thinking, the Clara Jensen case would be investigated as one where the victim might still be alive. This decision was not based on new evidence, but on acknowledging that the death assumption had never been proven. For some investigators accustomed to traditional methods, this was a bold, even risky step, as it forced them to view the entire file through a different lens. Instead of asking where Clara died, they began asking where Clara might have lived for the past 54 years. That question immediately changed how each old document page was read. Contradictions in witness statements, once deemed unimportant, now became points needing re-attention. The possibility that Clara might not have been alone in front of the grocery store, previously sidelined, was considered as meaningful if assuming she was taken by someone else. The list of those who left Gallup right after the disappearance, once stamped not relevant, was pulled from the secondary file and placed on the analysis table. The Cold Case Unit did not rush action. Instead, they took time to understand how the case had been shaped by initial decisions. They realized that for years, the Clara Jensen file had been read with one sole goal: finding closure. Now, their goal was finding continuation. The decision to search for a living person led to a series of other strategic consequences. The investigation focus was no longer the desert terrain around Gallup, but data systems, birth records, adoption records, social security data, and information sources that did not exist in 1970 or could not be connected then. Investigators understood that if Clara was alive, she must have grown up under a different identity, somewhere else, with a history recorded on paper. This meant the truth was not out there in the dust, but somewhere in administrative databases scattered across America. This mindset shift also forced the team to accept an uncomfortable reality. If Clara was alive, the initial investigation not only failed to find what happened, but inadvertently overlooked another crime, the theft of a child's identity and life. However, the cold case unit approached the issue not with emotion or judgment, but with pure investigative logic. They posed a new series of questions, each challenging old assumptions. Were there any late registered births matching the time Clara vanished? Were there adoption cases lacking legal paperwork in that period? Were there individuals suddenly appearing with a child without clear birth history? These questions were not meant to draw immediate conclusions, but to expand the investigation space in a direction never exploited before. In internal meetings, one investigator remarked that the Clara Jensen file was like a room locked for years, not because there was no key, but because everyone tried opening it with the wrong door. Shifting from searching for a body to searching for a living person was the act of going back and trying another door. Though no evidence yet confirmed Clara was still alive, this decision created new momentum for a file frozen too long. It allowed investigators to approach the case not as latecomers closing an old story, but as those first asking the right question. When the cold case unit officially recorded the new investigation strategy in the file, it was not just a method change, but an acknowledgement that for over 50 years, the Clara Jensen case had been dominated by an unverified assumption. From this point, the investigation entered a completely different phase, where the goal was no longer confirming death but tracing existence. A risky direction, but the only one left if the truth had never been where everyone searched for half a century. After the New Mexico cold case unit agreed on the strategy of searching for a living person instead of a body, the first foundational step was to take the Clara Jensen case out of the local scope and place it into the federal data ecosystem, where traces of a life, no matter how cleverly hidden, are hard to completely erase. Investigators began with national missing persons databases, not to find Clara as a 5-year-old child, but to determine if the name Clara Jensen had ever been linked to any other records over the more than 50 years. The results quickly showed what the local file had long reflected: no updates, no reliable sightings, no traces indicating Clara Jensen had ever reappeared under her own identity. This emptiness did not disappoint the investigation team. On the contrary, it reinforced the new assumption that if Clara was alive, she had not grown up with that name. From there, focus immediately shifted to data systems that in 1970 were not connected or did not even exist in their current form: birth records and adoption records. Investigators approached federal and state birth data with a carefully constructed set of criteria, based on what they knew for certain: Clara's birth year, the disappearance area, and the short period afterward, when a new identity might have been created. They paid special attention to cases of late registered births, records where the birth date was noted but did not match the registration date, or lacked information about the hospital and medical staff handling the birth. In the early phase, this list was longer than expected, reflecting the reality that in the early 1970s, birth record management in many states was still fragmented, especially in rural areas or for home births. However, as criteria were tightened, focusing on records with birth dates in 1970 and registered between 1970 and 1972, the list began to narrow. In parallel, the team accessed adoption databases, both legal and those previously suspected of administrative errors. They were not looking for a complete adoption case, because if Clara had been taken illegally, the chances were high that no full legal process had been followed. Instead, they searched for gaps: children appearing in family records without clear prior adoption history, or cases where paperwork was completed after the child had already lived with the family for a time. This work required high patience and systematization, as each record needed careful reading to understand its formation context, not just numbers and dates. One investigator commented that it was like rereading American history through small discrepancies in administrative papers. As cross-referencing deepened, the cold case unit began building a more precise time filter. They identified the period from summer 1970 to the end of 1972 as the key window, because that was when a missing 5-year-old could be reborn under a new identity without drawing too much attention. Birth records amended during this period were placed under special review. Amendments could be very minor, changing parents' names, updating birthplace, or adjusting registration dates. However, in the investigation context, these seemingly administrative edits held great significance, as they indicated a story that had once been rewritten. Investigators did not rush to conclusions from any single record. Instead, they cross-referenced across data systems, searching for rare intersections where multiple anomalies coexisted. A late registered birth might be the result of normal delay, but a late registered birth, lacking hospital information, and tied to a family that had moved across multiple states in a short period, was a different story. In this process, the team also faced legal and ethical limits on accessing personal data. Every step required approval, every query had to have a justified reason recorded, because they were not just seeking truth, but also protecting the privacy of potentially completely innocent people. This slowed progress, but also forced the cold case unit to think carefully about each direction, avoiding pursuit of baseless hypotheses. Gradually, from a massive data block, some records began emerging as points of attention, not because they perfectly matched the Clara Jensen story, but because they did not match themselves. These records had small but persistent gaps, missing birth witnesses, unusual address changes in short times, or intervention by the same administrative clerk in multiple cases. For the investigation team, these were not evidence but signs they were on the right path. Federal data cross-referencing did not bring immediate answers, but it achieved something more important. For the first time in over 50 years, the Clara Jensen file was no longer limited to what happened in Gallup on a summer morning in 1970. It was placed in a broader picture, where identity, paperwork, and personal history could be manipulated, and where truth might hide not in human memories, but in seemingly indifferent data lines. When this cross-referencing phase ended, the cold case unit understood they had opened a new door for the investigation, a door leading to the possibility that Clara Jensen was not just a name in a missing persons file, but a person who had lived, grown up, and existed somewhere in the system they were beginning to trace step by step. The biggest turning point in the investigation did not come from a confession or a lost document, but from a cold scientific process conducted more than 100 miles from Gallup, at a laboratory in Flagstaff, Arizona. After many months of federal data cross-referencing, without attaching any specific identity to the possibility that Clara Jensen was alive, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit reached a decision never before considered, using DNA as the central tool to break through the half-century-old wall of assumptions. This decision was made in a context where the Clara file had no direct biological sample from the victim, a major challenge, but no longer an absolute barrier in the era of genetic genealogy. Investigators began by collecting DNA samples from surviving Jensen family relatives, focusing on direct blood relations, close enough to produce clear genetic signals. These samples were handled carefully, not just for legal value, but because this was the first time in over 50 years, the Clara Jensen file had a completely new element, independent of human memories or old investigation assumptions. When DNA samples were sent to the Flagstaff lab, no one on the team expected quick results. They understood DNA does not tell the story itself. It only provides data, and that data needs the right context to become meaningful. While waiting, the cold case unit continued reviewing previously filtered birth and adoption records, preparing for the possibility that DNA results would force them back to names once deemed insufficiently strong. When the Flagstaff report was sent back, it did not arrive as a definitive conclusion, but as a set of indicators and probabilities. However, an initial glance was enough for investigators to understand they faced something unprecedented in this case's history. The analysis showed a clear direct blood relationship between the Jensen family DNA and a sample collected from a living adult female individual who in official databases did not bear the name Clara Jensen and had no links to Gallup, New Mexico, in her personal records. This result both confirmed and refuted. It confirmed Clara Jensen had not vanished from the world, but completely refuted the assumption she had lived her whole life under her real identity. For the investigation team, this was the moment the over 50-year death assumption officially collapsed. However, the DNA result also raised a new, equally complex issue. In all living person systems they had checked, no individual bearing the identity Clara Jensen had legal ties to the Jensen family. This meant that if Clara was alive, her real identity had been completely erased from official records, replaced by a different name, a different history, and a life recorded as having no interruption. Investigators returned to the file with a completely new perspective. Discrepancies in birth certificates, records amended in 1970, 1972, were no longer vague administrative anomalies, but possibilities needing serious review. DNA did not tell them where Clara went, who took her, or why it happened, but it told them something more important than all that. Every past investigation direction had been wrong at the most fundamental point. Clara did not die in the desert, did not vanish due to the environment, and was not a disappearance ending in anonymous death. She had lived. However, DNA confirming blood relation did not mean immediately determining Clara's current identity. Legal and ethical procedures forced the team to proceed step by careful step, because they were not just seeking truth, but facing a person who had lived an entire life under a different identity, with family, work, and separate history. Approaching this individual could not happen like a normal arrest or interrogation. It required coordination between investigators, prosecutors, and psychological experts. In closed meetings, the cold case unit discussed the meaning of Clara Jensen not existing in the living person system. This was not just an administrative fact, but evidence that the 1970 disappearance was not a random accident, but an intentional act to completely sever Clara's ties to her original life. DNA, in this case, became the only bridge between two parallel lives, one life frozen in a cold case file, and one life that had continued in silence for 54 years. When the Flagstaff results were officially entered into the file, they completely changed the case's legal and investigative status. Clara Jensen was no longer a victim presumed deceased, but a living person with an unrecovered identity. This forced authorities to re-examine the entire 1970 event chain from the perspective of a decades-long kidnapping and identity change. For the investigators holding the DNA report, that moment carried heavy meaning. They were not just solving an old case, but standing at the edge of reversing half a century of mistakes. DNA did not answer every question, but it did what no statement or hypothesis ever had. It forced the truth to emerge, no matter how complex and hard to accept. From this point, the investigation entered a new phase, where the question was no longer whether Clara Jensen was alive, but who Clara Jensen was living as, and how an entire system had failed to notice it for over 50 years. When the DNA results from Flagstaff confirmed the existence of a direct blood relationship, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit entered the most sensitive phase of the entire investigation, tracing back the false identity that Clara Jensen had lived under for more than half a century. Investigators understood that DNA had opened the door, but behind that door was not a familiar name, but a system of paperwork built solidly enough to survive decades without suspicion. The focus now was no longer on confirming who, but on decoding how. From the previously filtered data files, one name began to emerge, not because of a perfect match, but because of its systematic imperfections. This individual bore a completely different legal name, with no administrative links to Gallup or the Jensen family, and throughout her adult life, that name existed legally, used in education, employment, marriage, and civil transactions like any other citizen. However, when this individual's birth record was placed under the investigative microscope, small but persistent anomalies began to reveal themselves. The birth certificate was registered late, not days or weeks, but many months after the recorded birth date. The section on the medical facility where the birth occurred was blank or filled with generic phrases. No specific hospital name, no signatures from the doctor or nurse handling the birth. In the context of the early 1970s, such omissions were not unheard of, but the combination of multiple omissions in one record made it impossible for investigators to overlook. When cross-referencing the birth date recorded in this certificate with Clara Jensen's original file, a key detail emerged. The birth date matched exactly, not off by a few days or weeks, but the same day the same year. For the cold case unit team, this was the moment administrative data and biological evidence began to converge. However, they remained cautious, as a single match was not enough to conclude identity, especially with the enormous legal and personal consequences of such confirmation. Investigators continued expanding analysis of this birth record, tracing its amendment history. They discovered the birth certificate had been administratively edited in the child's early life, with minor changes to parents' residential address, but no accompanying medical documents. These amendments were valid under the processes of that era, but lacked the usual supporting evidence, like hospital records or birth certifications. For the investigation team, this suggested a clearer scenario. This identity was not created randomly, but built step by step, exploiting administrative gaps in a time when federal systems were not tightly connected. In parallel with paperwork analysis, investigators cross-referenced the movement history of the family named in the birth record. They noted a series of interstate moves in the period right after summer 1970, coinciding with the time Clara Jensen vanished. There was no direct evidence these people had ever been in Gallup, but no documents ruled out that possibility either. The gaps in residency history, previously seen as mere administrative oversights, now carried different meaning when placed alongside DNA results. Most importantly, throughout her adulthood, the individual with this false identity had never been suspected or investigated for any wrongdoing. Her life followed a normal trajectory to the point where no one, including possibly herself, had reason to doubt the foundation of her identity was untrue. This created a heartbreaking paradox for the investigation team. They stood before evidence of a crime committed in the past, but the consequence of that crime was a person who had lived an entire life unaware she was a victim. In closed meetings, investigators discussed the next approach, as confirming the false identity could not rely solely on data and DNA. It required a humane and legally careful strategy. The matching birth date cross-reference was the final piece making the picture clearer, but it also raised the biggest question: does this individual know she is Clara Jensen? The late registered birth record, lacking medical data, and a completely different legal identity from her past, had created a thick protective shell, enough to hide the truth for over 50 years. When investigators recorded these findings in the file, they understood the investigation had crossed the boundary of an ordinary criminal case. This was not just about determining who did what in 1970, but preparing to face an adult person who might have to relearn her entire life story. The false identity was no longer an abstract concept in the file. It had become a living entity, tied to a real life, and dismantling it required absolute precision, as even a small mistake could cause irreversible harm. When this part of the investigation concluded, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit stood at a new boundary. They had found Clara Jensen's false identity, but confirming and announcing that truth would be a greater challenge than discovering it. When the false identity began to appear with sharper outlines, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit moved to the deepest administrative analysis phase, tracing the amendment history of the papers that had created and protected that identity for over half a century. What initially looked like scattered omissions now stacked up, forming a chain of intentional interventions. Investigators requested full extraction of the late registered birth record's change history, including every update, addition, and amendment since initial registration. Results showed the record had not remained static. It had been touched multiple times in the child's early years, each time changing only a small detail: residential address, guardian's surname, or parental personal information, but overall creating a thick layer obscuring the true origin. Notably, these amendments did not occur randomly over time, but concentrated in a narrow period, coinciding with the early 1970s, when interstate data sharing was limited, and verification processes relied mainly on submitted papers. In federal cross-referencing, one discovery made the entire team pause. The signature of the same administrative clerk appeared on documents in two different states, hundreds of miles apart. This signature not only matched in pen strokes, but in form and placement on forms, as if copied from a fixed template. Investigators requested independent signature examination, and preliminary conclusions indicated a very high likelihood it was the same person or source. This went far beyond ordinary administrative error. A single clerk could hardly legally sign documents in two states in the same period without unusual coordination or authorization. As they continued reviewing related records, the team discovered the same signature on other supporting papers, residency confirmations, guardian information forms, all centered on solidifying the child's identity in early years. The picture began to emerge, not a single forgery, but a sustained series of actions to ensure the new identity held up against various administrative checks. Investigators continued digging into the roles of those named in the record. They found some individuals repeatedly appearing as sponsors or information confirmers, though their legal relationship to the child was not clearly described. These names also appeared in records in another state, forming a thin but durable network supporting movement and paperwork registration without drawing attention. There was no evidence of a large criminal ring in the modern sense, but signs of organized concealment were undeniable. That organization showed in how every amendment was valid on paper, complying with ERA processes, and avoiding sudden changes that could trigger deeper scrutiny. The cold case unit noted this was low-noise concealment, not requiring great power or resources, but exploiting system fragmentation and default trust between local agencies. When cross-referencing amendment timelines with the named family's movement history, a clearer pattern emerged. Each time the family changed states or addresses, the child's papers were updated soon after, as a preventive reinforcement. This indicated the person behind the amendments understood the system's most vulnerable points, and proactively strengthened them before questions could arise. Investigators also noted the significant absence of medical records in infancy and early childhood, no hospital birth confirmation, no early vaccination history, or only late-added records. These gaps, taken alone, could be explained by personal circumstances, but alongside the chain of amendments and repeated signatures, they became part of the same concealment strategy. For the team, the question was no longer whether concealment existed, but who organized it and why. Determining individual responsibility faced many legal barriers, as many involved had died or lacked records for prosecution. However, proving an organized concealment mechanism was enough to reframe the case. This was not just a late-resolved disappearance, but a years-long series of acts to change a child's identity. In internal memos, the cold case unit emphasized the difference between forgery and maintaining forgery. This case fell into the latter, a continuous process to keep the story consistent against scattered system checks. When findings on amended papers were compiled and added to the file, they formed a solid foundation for the next phase, confronting the person behind the false identity. But before that, the team had to accept a heavy reality. The concealment succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it fit how the system operated then. And thus, exposing it in 2023 was not just solving a case, but confronting historical gaps that allowed a child to vanish from her own life for over half a century. When evidence of amended papers and signs of organized concealment was enough to reframe the case, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit returned to the starting point long considered closed, the summer of 1970. This time, they viewed that summer not through the eyes of investigators seeking an accident or death, but through the lens of an identity change prepared and executed in a short time. Focus was placed on cross-referencing movement timelines of individuals potentially accessing Clara Jensen the morning she vanished, while matching administrative anomalies discovered later in the file. Each day in June and July 1970 was reconstructed using fragmented data sources, short-term rental contracts, seasonal work records, interstate travel receipts, and temporary residency registrations. This work was slow and laborious, as no clear straight line connected 1970 Gallup to the later established false identity. However, as timelines were placed side by side, a series of matches began to appear. A woman appeared in temporary residency records in Gallup that summer, not as a long-term resident, but as a short-stay visitor, exactly during the time Clara Jensen vanished. This woman was not on the 1970 witness interview list, nor in late reviewed people who left town notes, as she left Gallup almost immediately, before expanded questioning rounds began. Investigators traced her through administrative documents in another state, where she appeared just weeks later with a small child, introduced as her biological child. Notably, there were no legal adoption records linked to this woman in that period. No court decision, no custody transfer certificate, no trace of a valid legal process. For the team, the complete absence of adoption records was not direct proof of crime, but it alarmingly fit the previously identified concealment pattern. When cross-referencing this woman's movement timeline with late birth record amendments, the dates nearly matched week by week. Her appearance in the new state coincided with the child's birth record registration, lacking medical data, and signed by a signature appearing in multiple states. This forced investigators to re-ask about her role in summer 1970. She was not just an anonymous passerby, she was the only link connecting Gallup to the decades-maintained false identity. In deeper review, the cold case unit discovered this woman had held short-term jobs in service and child care, positions allowing child contact without rigorous background checks like today. No record showed her ever investigated or suspected in the past, and her life after summer 1970 was relatively private, leaving no signs drawing authority attention. This posed an uncomfortable paradox. Without modern DNA and federal data, nothing was strong enough to pull this woman back to the investigation center. The team continued timeline cross-referencing, focusing on days right after Clara vanished. They noted her Gallup departure occurred in a very narrow window, early enough to avoid initial canvasses, but late enough to access Clara that fateful morning. No evidence she appeared at the grocery store or on Clara's route, but that very absence fit how the event unfolded: quick, silent, traceless. When placing this timeline beside the lack of legal adoption records, the picture grew clearer. The child appearing with the woman in another state was not the result of an overlooked legal process, but of no process from the start. Late birth registration, multiple amendments, and false identity maintenance were ways to fill that legal void. In internal memos, the cold case unit described this case phase as history's breaking point, where one personal decision in summer 1970 created effects lasting over half a century. Revisiting that summer brought no sense of victory but heaviness, as it showed everything happened in a very short time, before any system could react. The lack of legal adoption records was not just an administrative detail, it was evidence Clara Jensen was stripped of her right to exist under her own identity from the beginning. When this timeline cross-reference concluded, the team understood they had reached the boundary between past and present. Summer 1970 was no longer a vague memory in a cold case file, but a specific chain of events, with specific people and specific decisions. From this point, the investigation was no longer about piecing data, but preparing to face the case's most vivid truth. Clara Jensen was taken by a real person, in a very short time, and lived the next 54 years unaware of what she had lost that summer morning. When the pieces about the false identity, amended papers, and the 1970 summer timeline fit together, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit did not rush to announce a conclusion. With a case spanning over half a century, where every assumption once believed true had collapsed, the investigation team understood that only one final multi-source independent scientific confirmation could close the file indisputably. The decision was made: proceed with the highest level of DNA verification, beyond a single match, to rule out any possibility of error, inaccuracy, or rare coincidence. DNA samples were taken not just from one branch of the Jensen family, but from multiple sources in the family tree, including direct and collateral relations, to create a genetic signature dense enough to withstand any legal challenge. In parallel, the DNA sample from the individual with the false identity, the one whose administrative records showed a birth date matching Clara's, was processed under the strictest standards, ensuring no gaps in the chain of custody or analysis. Samples were sent to multiple independent laboratories, including facilities specializing in genetic genealogy and complex kinship determination, for parallel analysis. The goal was not just to find a match, but to verify that match consistently across multiple places and methods. When the first reports came back, they were not surprising but carried unprecedented weight. Analyses showed a direct blood relationship, confirmed with extremely high probability, far exceeding thresholds used in criminal and civil cases. There were no signs of random coincidence or distant kinship explaining the results. Subsequent reports from different laboratories all reached the same conclusion, independently and unaffected by input data from other groups. For the investigation team, this was the moment science officially surpassed every hypothesis, speculation, and story built over years. Multi-source DNA did not just say the individual with the false identity was linked to the Jensen family, it said that link was undeniable. However, the cold case unit proceeded with one final verification step: integrative cross-referencing DNA results with the entire chain of collected administrative data. They rechecked paper amendment timelines, repeated signatures, interstate movement history, and the legal gap of no valid adoption records. Everything fit a single scenario without additional assumptions. Clara Jensen was taken from Gallup in summer 1970 and raised under a different identity, protected by an intentionally amended paper system. When all cross-references were complete, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit convened an interagency meeting, including prosecutors, forensic experts, ethics advisors, and participating scientists. The meeting was not to debate results. The results were too clear, but to agree on how to phrase the official conclusion accurately, cautiously, and respectfully toward the person behind the numbers. After over 50 years, the Clara Jensen file for the first time had a conclusion line without conditions or assumptions: Clara Jensen is alive. This phrase, seemingly simple, carried the weight of decades of mistakes, oversights, and untested assumptions. It did not say every question was answered, but it confirmed the most fundamental: the 5-year-old child, who vanished in Gallup in 1970, did not die in the desert, did not become a nameless name, and did not end her life in cold case pages. She lived, grew up, and existed in this world, though under a different name. Recording this conclusion in the file was not a celebratory ritual, no applause, no sense of victory. Instead, prolonged silence, as everyone present understood this final scientific confirmation also meant facing an unacceptable truth: the system had failed to protect a child, and to ask the right questions for over half a century. Investigators discussed next steps with utmost caution. Announcing the conclusion Clara Jensen is alive was not just legal, but an action with profound impact on an adult's life, who might never have doubted her origins. Thus, all information was sealed confidential, all statements drafted in neutral, precise language, avoiding sensationalism. Multi-source DNA had fulfilled its role, not as the story's end, but as an unshakable foundation for retelling the story truthfully. When the official conclusion was signed and filed, Clara Jensen was no longer a hypothesis, no longer a slim late-raised possibility. She became a scientifically confirmed truth at the highest level. And that confirmation opened a new chapter for the case, not one of searching, but of confronting the real person, the stolen past, and consequences no DNA result could resolve alone. When the final scientific conclusion was signed and filed, the Clara Jensen case crossed an irreversible legal boundary. The New Mexico Cold Case Unit officially transformed the file's nature from a prolonged child disappearance to a deliberate series of crimes: child kidnapping and identity theft. This transformation was not just a label change, it brought a completely new legal structure, forcing authorities to reread the entire 1970 summer through modern criminal law language. Previously, all efforts revolved around what happened to Clara. Now the question became, who did what, how and for how long. Confirming Clara was alive collapsed the death assumption foundation while opening criminal liability for acts once covered by time and administrative gaps. First was child kidnapping, with confirmed facts: a 5-year-old taken from a familiar environment without parental consent, no legal transfer records. The elements of kidnapping were met. Investigators reconstructed this as a short but decisive chain approach: separation from the safe route, leaving Gallup in an hours-long window, and taking the child to another state. Lack of violent signs did not weaken the crime, instead it fit a silent kidnapping, exploiting a young child's trust and societal complacency. Next was identity theft, a seemingly modern legal concept but present from the moment the new identity was created and maintained. Investigators and prosecutors analyzed the administrative chain: late birth registration, multiple amendments, repeated signatures across states, and absent newborn medical records. Each act alone might fall into gray areas. Together they formed a decades-long false identity maintenance mechanism. Here, identity theft was not just using another's name, but appropriating the legal right to exist under the original identity, the right to family, history, and origin truth. Case transformation also forced prosecutors to determine jurisdiction and statutes of limitations. Some charges might have expired under 1970s law, but the years-long false identity maintenance opened continuing offense arguments. Each paper amendment, each false identity used for schooling, work, or citizen benefits, continued the violation. This approach allowed modern law to intervene in a historical crime without denying limitation boundaries, focusing on links still legally accountable. Another key shift was the victim's role. Clara Jensen was no longer a deceased victim or nameless victim, but a living person, an adult with rights, privacy, and self-determination. This forced the team to adjust information gathering and disclosure. Every step balanced pursuit of accountability with protecting the individual who lived a full life under another identity. In memos, the cold case unit emphasized, "Do no harm, truth must emerge, but not by shattering the victim's current life." Case transformation also changed evidence evaluation. Multi-source DNA was no longer just identity confirmation, but foundation proving intent in concealment. Administrative data, once context, became central evidence, proving conscious false identity maintenance. Movement timeline, absent legal adoption records, and repeated signatures, formed a logical chain convincing a jury this was not error but a plan. In interagency meetings, prosecutors asked the hard question: who are suitable suspects when many involved are deceased or lack direct evidence? The answer was not simple, and the cold case unit did not avoid this reality. Focus shifted to act-based responsibility: who organized, supported, maintained, rather than pinning one individual for the entire chain. Simultaneously, the team prepared civil and administrative options, restoring original identity, amending papers, and securing victim benefits if full criminal prosecution was impossible. Finally, case transformation held meaning beyond one file. It sent a message on learning from historical mistakes. A wrong assumption can lock investigation for decades, data and science can reopen seemingly closed doors, and justice is not just punishment, but restoring truth and identity. When the Clara Jensen file was updated with new charges, it was not an end, but a comma, a turning point for the next phase, where truth must be faced through law, ethics, and respect for the person who survived half a century, deprived of herself. When the case was officially transformed to kidnapping and identity theft charges, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit entered the highest legal action phase since reopening the file, identifying and arresting living individuals with direct roles in the over half-century concealment chain. This decision was not rushed. Prosecutors and investigators understood each arrest warrant must hold in court, based on specific evidence, not historical inference. After multiple reviews, a group of individuals was identified as key involved at varying levels, from directly taking Clara from Gallup in summer 1970, to supporting false identity maintenance through intentional administrative acts. Arrest warrants were drafted tightly, focusing on specific acts, still within limitations, or continuing, avoiding overreach beyond provable evidence. When judges signed these warrants, it was not just arrest permission, but judicial recognition. The Clara Jensen case had entered accountability pursuit. Arrests occurred under covert plans, prioritizing surprise to preserve evidence. Simultaneously, search warrants were executed on personal archives, old offices, and locations tied to false identity paperwork. Investigators sought no single golden evidence, they sought small pieces, paper copies, contact notebooks, letters, forgotten administrative records. Searching old files yielded unexpected results. Many documents showed paper amendments were not one person's lone acts, but coordinated over time. Similar forms appeared across years, same phrasing, same signature placement, indicating an unofficial but consistent process. In some files, investigators found handwritten notes hinting at synchronizing information before state moves, a small detail, but enough to prove concealment intent. When documents were assembled and cross-referenced, the concealment network emerged clearer. Not a traditional large organization, but a chain of relationships, based on acquaintance, benefit, and system gap knowledge. One person took the child away, another helped initial paperwork. Subsequent ones ensured the identity past key administrative milestones, like schooling, residency changes, and benefits registration. Each link did a small part, enough to self-convince no full responsibility. But together, the overall picture allowed no denial. During arrests and interrogations, investigators adhered to initial principles: victim protection, no public confrontation with the false identity bearer, all procedures separate to avoid unnecessary harm. Interrogation focus was specific administrative acts and decisions, not unrelated personal life. Some involved cooperated, providing information on paper amendments and who requested them. These statements, independently verified, further solidified the concealment network structure. Others remained silent on legal advice. Their silence did not weaken the file, as paper evidence and DNA sufficed to establish roles. In parallel with arrests, the team conducted a comprehensive review of records touched by the repeated cross-state signature. Results showed Clara Jensen was not the only case affected by this mechanism, though the most severe. This discovery did not infinitely expand the case. It provided context and motive, a familiar practice applied when needing papers to match. For prosecutors, it strengthened organized conduct arguments, even without formal name or structure. As news of warrants and searches spread in legal circles, the cold case unit tightly controlled public information. Press releases only confirmed lawful warrant execution, avoiding victim-identifying details. The goal was preserving proceedings and minimizing media impact on a person who lived half a century in hidden truth. Internally, the team noted a clear emotional shift from analysis tension to ethical responsibility. Arrests were no longer professional wins, they were necessary steps to bring truth to light without creating more victims. When the concealment network was exposed, and the key links were placed under legal control, the Clara Jensen case entered a new threshold. What had once been deemed not relevant was now repositioned correctly. Paper amendments that seemed harmless were called by their true name. Investigators knew the road ahead. Court, litigation, and legal consequences would be long and complex. But at this point, one thing had become irreversible. The over 50-year concealment was no longer a story hidden in the file. It had been exposed through arrest warrants, paper evidence, and DNA science, enough to bring the case from historical darkness into the light of legal accountability. The trial for the Clara Jensen case took place in an atmosphere of rare tension, not because of violent details or dramatic testimony, but because the entire proceedings were enveloped by the weight of time. More than 50 years had passed since the summer of 1970, and as soon as the trial began, the biggest question was not what happened, but does the law still have the right to intervene? Arguments over statutes of limitations quickly became the central battleground. Defense counsel argued that the kidnapping, if any, was completed when Clara was taken from Gallup, and under the criminal law applicable then, all prosecution deadlines had long expired. They emphasized that one cannot drag a half-century dormant event into the present just because modern investigative tools had emerged. In their view, doing so would set a dangerous precedent, where any old case could be revived, regardless of time limits established by law to ensure societal stability. Prosecutors countered with a completely different approach, viewing the case not as a single act ending in 1970, but as a continuing series of crimes. They presented to the court that each paper amendment, each use of the false identity for schooling, employment, marriage, or citizen benefits, repeated the violation of the victim's personal rights. Under this argument, limitations could not be counted from the initial point, as the offense had never actually ceased. The judge listened to both sides with evident caution, as this was the intersection between traditional jurisprudence and new understanding of identity crimes in the modern world. As limitations arguments had not yet cooled, the trial shifted to the most important evidence pillar, DNA and paperwork. Forensic experts were called to the witness stand to explain in detail the multi-source DNA analysis process, from sample collection and preservation to independent cross-verification at multiple laboratories. They presented cold probability figures showing direct blood relation, confirmed at near absolute levels. Prosecutors stressed this was not a single questionable result, but repeated, independent, consistent matching. Defense tried to shake that confidence by questioning error possibilities, rare genetic coincidences, and interpreting scientific data for a non-expert jury. However, each effort met the evidence consistency: multiple labs, multiple methods, same conclusion. In parallel with DNA, amended administrative documents were presented as a companion story, where science and papers complemented each other. Prosecutors projected copies of late registered birth certificates, each address amendment, each repeated signature across states. They did not present these as isolated errors, but as an intentional pattern maintained over years to protect a false identity. Defense counsel countered that 1970s administrative systems were fragmented, unstandardized, and full of technical mistakes. In their view, finding anomalies did not prove criminal intent, but when prosecutors placed documents from different times side by side, with the same phrasing, same signature style, same legalization purpose, the picture no longer resembled randomness. The trial gradually entered its most sensitive debate area, where law and ethics collided directly. Defense lawyers questioned whether trying the case after over 50 years truly served justice, or merely satisfied the system's need to correct mistakes. They argued the victim had lived her entire life under another identity, building family, career and social relationships, and that dredging up the past could cause new, equally serious harm. Prosecutors replied that decades of silence was the greatest denial of justice. In their view, the right to know one's origins is fundamental and cannot be erased just because time passed. The judge repeatedly reminded parties to stay within legal bounds, but acknowledged in instructions that this was a case where ethical emotions could not be completely separated from legal decisions. Clara Jensen's absence from the courtroom created a heavy void. She did not appear as a witness or sit in the gallery, and that decision was absolutely respected by the court. But that very absence made every argument sharper, as all were speaking about a person not speaking for herself, a life shaped by decisions beyond her control at age 5. When parties finished presentations, the jury was given no simple task, not just evaluating crime elements, but weighing how law should respond to a late-arriving truth. The Clara Jensen trial was not just a place to judge right and wrong, but a test of the justice system's ability to reconcile modern scientific evidence, flawed historical records, and profound ethical questions about time and responsibility. As the jury left to deliberate, no one dared predict the verdict's direction, but one thing was undeniable: this trial forced law to look straight at its own limits, and society to face the truth that justice, though late, still demands to be named. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was silent enough to hear the clerk's page turning. The verdict was read slowly, each word carrying the weight of over 50 years of waiting. The court confirmed that kidnapping and false identity maintenance had occurred, that Clara Jensen was taken from Gallup in summer 1970, and deprived of her right to exist under her true identity for decades. However, the court also confirmed an unchangeable reality: the person who directly committed the kidnapping had died. Thus, no prison sentence was imposed on the primary perpetrator. This decision was not surprising, but brought a hard-to-name emptiness, as criminal justice, in the sense of punishment, had no remaining target. Though no prison sentence, the verdict did not stop there. The court went beyond recording truth. It officially confirmed that truth with full legal value. In the conclusion, the judge stated clearly that Clara Jensen is alive, that the legal identity she bore for 54 years resulted from a series of unlawful acts, and that the 1970 missing person file was updated as resolved in fact. This was not symbolic, it was a legal decision forcing federal and state agencies to amend records, sync data, and restore the victim's original identity per her wishes. Truth, for the first time, was no longer an internal investigation conclusion or sealed scientific result, but a judgment entered into precedent. In explaining the verdict, the court acknowledged law's limits before time. Inability to sentence the primary perpetrator was not forgiveness, but consequence of biological and legal reality. However, the court emphasized responsibility does not vanish with death, it transforms into duty to restore and recognize. Living defendants involved in false identity maintenance were handled within remaining effective responsibility scopes, with appropriate sanctions, not for revenge, but to establish clear legal boundaries for similar future acts. The court also ordered review and correction of related administrative records, viewing this as part of systemic rectification. The verdict devoted many pages to evidence value of DNA and papers. The court affirmed multi-source DNA as undeniable identity confirmation foundation, and that amended records, repeated signatures, and medical gaps could not be explained as random errors. Combining science with administrative data was seen as the standard model for historical identity cases where human memories have faded. At the same time, the court warned of ethical caution. Science allows truth discovery, but disclosure and implementation must center the person. The verdict announcement moment had no cheers, no sense of victory. Those present understood this was a different form of justice, not punishment justice, but confirmation justice. Clara Jensen was no longer a name in a cold case file. She was a person called by her true name by law. The primary perpetrator's death left the story without a familiar movie ending, but it also forced society to face that not every crime can close with prison bars. After the trial, authorities began implementing the verdict's specific consequences. The missing person file was updated in national systems, federal papers amended through legal process, and victim privacy protections activated. The court also recommended legislatures consider updating frameworks for child identity crimes and continuing offenses to avoid repeating 1970s gaps. The verdict closed litigation, but opened another phase, living with truth. For case followers, lingering emotions mixed relief and sorrow. Relief that truth was finally named, sorrow for the price, a stolen half-century. The court could not return lost childhood, but with this verdict, it did the minimum justice can confirm what happened was real wrong, and cannot be buried by time. When the courtroom doors closed, the Clara Jensen case did not end with the familiar gavel of a prison sentence. It ended with words entered into legal history: truth has been confirmed. And in a world where many cold cases remain forever unsolved, that confirmation, though late, still holds irreplaceable value. When the Clara Jensen file was closed in terms of litigation, the New Mexico Cold Case Unit proceeded to draft the final investigation conclusion, not to create a formal full stop, but to answer the most fundamental question: why a case with such key signs could remain frozen for over 50 years. This conclusion did not evade professional responsibility or try to disperse blame into historical context. On the contrary, it went straight into the professional errors that accumulated across phases, turning a kidnapping and identity theft into an unsolved disappearance in collective memory. The first error pointed out was the formation of a hypothesis too early and too rigidly. Right in the first week after Clara vanished, when no signs of accident or struggle were found, the investigation leaned heavily toward the hypothesis of the victim wandering off and dying due to the environment. This hypothesis was not illogical, but it was not proven by any physical evidence. However, once recorded in the official report, it quickly became the working truth dominating all subsequent decisions. Investigation directions not fitting that hypothesis gradually became secondary, then passively discarded. The second error directly related to handling witness statements. In the early days, some statements suggesting Clara might not have been alone in front of the grocery store were deemed insufficiently certain for the summary report. Prioritizing a neat, consistent story on paper lost inconvenient but important details. When the official report stated Clara was last seen alone, it not only reflected an interpretation, but shaped how future investigators read and understood the entire file. This error showed the dangerous power of administrative language. A seemingly neutral phrase can frame an entire investigation. The third error was failing to protect the critical time window on Route 66 in time. Not blocking or controlling traffic in the first hours stemmed from assessing no signs of crime. However, that cautious decision allowed every vehicle to leave Gallup unrecorded. When the investigation later recognized possible human intervention, the traffic flow, along with every tracing opportunity, had vanished. This was an important lesson in investigation risk management. In child disappearances, the cost of initially underreacting is often far greater than overreacting. The fourth error lay in underestimating those never questioned, the list of individuals leaving Gallup right after the case, especially the woman who took Clara, was only belatedly and superficially reviewed. Notes like "not relevant" were not based on exclusion evidence, but on not fitting the accepted death hypothesis. This showed how a system can close itself to inconvenient possibilities simply because they require re-asking foundational questions. The fifth error, and the most systemic, was not considering the possibility the victim was alive. For decades, the investigation goal was finding a body or death evidence. When that failed, the file was shelved as cold case without alternative strategy. Only when the 2023 Cold Case Unit changed approach, treating victim survival as a serious hypothesis, did scattered pieces begin connecting. Shifting the question from "where did Clara die" to "who is Clara living as" was not an emotional leap, but adherence to evidence logic. No death evidence means no default death. The Clara Jensen case was ultimately solved, not by random detail, but systematic combination of scientific evidence and administrative data. Multi-source DNA undeniably confirmed identity. Late birth registration, multiple paper amendments, repeated signatures, and absent legal adoption records proved the concealment mechanism. Cross-referencing movement timelines and federal data placed those evidences in correct historical context. Each factor alone might be debatable, but together, they formed an evidence structure strong enough to overcome old assumptions. The investigation conclusion also emphasized this was not failure of one individual or unit, but of investigation thinking limited by assumptions. The system worked hard but within a wrong question frame. When that frame changed, truth always existing in data had a chance to be seen. Closing the file, the Cold Case Unit did not declare victory. They recorded a confirmed truth, a restored identity, and clearly pointed out a chain of errors. Justice in this case came not as prison for the primary perpetrator, but as official, irreversible legal acknowledgement. That was the only feasible justice form, and the most important, returning truth to the one deprived of it, and returning lessons to the system that once missed them. The Clara Jensen story is not just a solved case, it is a very real reminder for America today about how we protect children and protect our own identities in a constantly moving society. In 1970, Clara vanished in just a short distance from home to the grocery store on Route 66, and the first mistake was assuming too early that she wandered off and died due to the environment, locking the investigation into body search and overlooking statements. Clara was not alone. The lesson for modern America is when there are unusual signs, do not let reasonableness replace evidence. In daily life, that means always keeping data and cross-checking doorbell cameras, location history, license plate photos, Quick reports to 911 Amber Alert when needed. Another lesson comes from federal data and DNA. Clara was only found when the 2023 Cold Case Unit asked the new question, search for a living person, then cross-referenced missing person databases, amended birth records from 1970, 1972, and finally, multi-source DNA from Flagstaff, showing direct relation to the Jensen family, despite Clara Jensen not existing in living person systems. In America today, that reminds us to value identity safety, check credit reports, freeze credit if suspicious, protect birth certificates, less SSN, and be wary of late registered, lacking medical data records, or amended papers. Finally, this story teaches a soft but important thing. Justice sometimes comes not as prison, but as legal truth confirmation and identity, returned to its rightful place. So do not give up on the right questions, no matter how long. If you believe truth, even if late is still worth naming, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following cases where justice never gives up. Thank you for listening to Clara Jensen's story, and see you in the next video.